listeners to the first of our podcasts in regard to a new book by author Sean Meek called In the Shadow of the Ark, which focuses on the Genesis flood. Hello, I am Jennifer Hidalgo, a lover of both books and book discussions, and I was invited to read an advance copy of this book, and today I'm interviewing the book's author, Sean Meek. Sean, for 25 years, you were the executive director of a creation ministry called Project Creation, in which you traveled across the United States speaking on the topic of Genesis and the creation to several groups and schools. And after retiring from this particular ministry, I know that you focused on writing this book, In the Shadow of the Ark, a story of the world before the Genesis flood. So I say we just dive in. I'm going to start the podcast by asking you about your book and its focus on Genesis by saying, Sean, does Genesis really matter?
Yes, it does. Genesis is the book of beginnings. And if the beginnings aren't clear, if the beginnings in the case of this, the Bible, isn't true, then the question is, when does God start telling us the truth? If he lies to us in the first words, when does he start telling us the true words? And the simple fact is, he tells us the truth in the very first words. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That is the truth. And we can see it both scientifically, and we can understand it historically, and we can see it biblically. And we can see that in all that we do about everything. In fact, especially when we talk about Genesis.
Well, could Genesis be intended as simply something symbolic or metaphorical?
No, and it can't be for a couple of reasons. First of all, Jesus spoke about Genesis a lot. In fact, he quoted from Genesis, especially the first 11 chapters, more than any other part of the Hebrew Bible. And here's a question you'd have to ask yourself. If Genesis isn't true, especially the first 11 chapters, then either Jesus deliberately lied to us or he was ignorant.
True.
And how could he be the Son of God? How could he be our Savior? How could he be all the things he says he was and is if he's a liar or ignorant? Either one. It doesn't even matter which one it would be, because either one would be dishonest. And Jesus was never dishonest. He was often, for the people around him, could be difficult because he spoke the truth. But he was never dishonest in anything he did. And we know that, so we know that Genesis has to be historically accurate in all that it says about what happened in the past and about what's going to happen in the future.
And also that it's a book of beginnings, right? A foundation to every significant doctrine in the Bible.
Every doctrine in the Bible is listed in Genesis. We go to Exodus, we see the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments that's just what Moses codified, or God codified them, gave to Moses. But everything in the Ten Commandments was there in Genesis. Everything, every either thing he said to do or not to do is in Genesis to begin with. And then God just codified it in the Ten Commandments to make it a little easier to read, get it all in a relatively short amount of space to do that. And we see that in the words that are used. For instance, it says in the beginning, it says in the first day, it was evening and morning was the first day, evening and morning was the second day. It goes into that. But then it says it again in Exodus. In Exodus chapter 20, it says, in 6 days God created the heavens, the earth, and the seas and all that's in them, and the seventh day he rested. So he says it in two different books, written over a period of well over 1,000, really almost 2,000 years apart, and by people who were clearly there when the things were said. And so the question is, if God's not telling us the truth in Genesis, then he can't be telling us the truth in Exodus. And then when does he tell us the truth? So yes, it has to be taken as a true story, a true history of the world and all that happened. And that's why that's what got me started writing the book at all. Because one of the questions, I had lots of questions, but one of the questions I had was, why did God send a flood? If the people were evil, but there have been other times in the Bible evil people were there, and God just struck them down in one way or another. Mm-hmm. But why did he destroy the whole world? And I go into some detail about why I think that happened. And that's why the book is biblical historical fiction. Now, in biblical historical fiction, you add to it, like in this case, I gave names to Noah's wife and his daughters-in-law, which the Bible does not supply us with. But nothing in this book contradicts the Bible in any way, shape, or form. It goes along with the Bible stories, as short as it is, and it just gives a background and some more information about what's happening. And when it comes to the question of Genesis and whether or not it should be taken as true, I think back to something that happened to me and my wife years ago. We went to London. And one Sunday morning, we wanted to see what it would be like in the local church, which is the Church of England.
Okay.
So we went to the Church of England that morning, And the building was able to hold between about 200, 250 people at least, maybe even more. I couldn't tell, but it was a pretty good-sized building. And we went in there, and all the people that were there were at the very first 2 rows. And they were all women, and there were about a dozen of them. When we walked in, we got close to the front, not quite there because we were members, and we just wanted to basically be observers. But the women came back and were very nice, very polite, and all. And then after we had all sat down, the Anglican priest came out, and and he said to the congregation, the dozen or so of us that were there, today my message is going to be on the inspired work of fiction, the book of Job.
Wow.
Now, when a so-called priest of God comes out and says the work is fiction, how can you put your life in a piece of fiction? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of fiction I like, but I wouldn't put my life in it. And again, you think of all the fiction you've heard. I mean, Peter Pan is a great story. Are you going to put your life in Peter Pan's hands? I mean, what think of the fiction that's out there. Some of it's really good stuff.
So if someone asks you, are the stories meant to be taken literally?
And the answer is yes, they are, because Jesus took them literally. He said, in the beginning, God created Adam and Eve. He goes on to say in Matthew chapter 24, verses 30 to 39, he says, as it was in the days of old, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah went into the ark, and then they were swept away. Now, the reason he said that, first he was saying as absolute literal truth, that really happened. That's when the flood started. But he's also making a point, which is one of the reasons I believe he wanted me to write this book, is because the people back then didn't realize their end time was coming. It was very, very short. Noah told him it was coming. He had about 120 years to preach righteousness to the people, get them to listen, because he was both a preacher of righteousness and he was the 8th prophet. But in 120 years, we have no evidence of anyone having been converted. Now, we don't know that didn't happen. I'll make that clear. We don't know that nobody was converted, but we have no record of it. So when the ark left, it only left with 8 people in it. And Jesus is telling us in Matthew, he says, in the days when the second coming, when the Son of Man comes again, the second coming of Christ, it'll be very much like it was in the days just before the flood. They'll be eating, drinking, married, and giving marriage until the time comes. Now, of course, the second coming is going to be quite different than the flood, because people are going to be around to see it in a way that they didn't see the flood, or at least didn't see it for very long. But nonetheless, it's going to come. It's going to come quickly. And if you're not prepared for it, if you don't know it's coming, you're going to be surprised, as the people back then were surprised when the time came. And although we don't know for certain if any of them tried to get in the ark, we do know this for certain: none of them did. Because one of the things I find interesting about this story about the whole flood and the ark and all is God closed the door in the ark. When Noah got in, all the animals and everyone was in, God closed that door. Do you know how Noah got out of the ark?
I don't.
He didn't open the door because he couldn't.
Okay.
Because God had closed that door, and that door would be closed forever. He actually had to take the roof off to get out of the ark. Because he'd put the roof on so he could take it off.
Oh, wow.
But he didn't close that door, so he couldn't open it. That's the point of what God was doing. He says, when that door's closed, then redemption is done. It's over. Whatever you are, that's where you are. That's what it's going to be. Mm-hmm. He's giving us time, and that's one reason I think he had me write this book, In the Shadow of the Ark, to make the point that the end time is coming, and if you don't pay attention, you're going to be trapped outside the ark when the time comes for the end to be, and you don't want to be outside that ark. Now, Jesus has been compared to the ark. We get our salvation by being in Jesus, by being saved through his blood, by being covered in him. And that's how we'll be. That's how those of us who are saved will be and have been saved, by being in Jesus, just as the people were saved by being in the actual wooden ark. Once you're in, if you're not in when the time comes, then you are out. You are definitely out of it. You're not gonna. There's no second chance after that. It's either then or not.
Well, here's a question for you. If Genesis isn't accurate, what would that mean?
Well, it would mean that everything in the Bible was false. As they say, if Genesis is not accurate, Jesus lied, or he was ignorant. Think of all what Jesus said. Which parts of what Jesus said are true and which parts are lies? Did Jesus ever lie in the Bible? Did he ever tell a lie? No, he did not. He often told how other people had lied about some things, but he made it clear that what the truth was. Because it says about Jesus said about himself, Jesus speaking of himself, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And when he said that, he wasn't just saying he spoke not just that he spoke truth, but he was the truth. Because there's no truth outside of Jesus.
Sure.
We think about physics, and think about gravity, think about speed of light, think about all things in physics. Those are all from Jesus. Because who created light? Jesus did. It's the second person in the Trinity, the Creator. He created light. So when we talk about the speed of light, it's the speed he set for it. When you think about gravity, how does gravity exist? Because matter exists. Who created matter? Jesus did. He created all these things. He is not just the truth about the Bible and about what we think of as religious subjects. He's the truth about everything. And the shadow of the ark is telling part of that truth, not the whole truth, of course, because we don't know all of it, but it's telling the truth about what happened, as far as I can figure out what happened before the flood came, and how bad it was. And again, the book goes into more of the details about why I believe God destroyed the whole world instead of just destroying evil people, which he had done. As I say, later in the Bible, it talks about times when he destroyed just the evil people, sent the angel of death to go over and take care of them, or had other ways of doing it. There are different ways he did it at different times.
Sure.
But in each case, he gave them time. He gave them a chance to repent. God always gives us a chance to repent, but he doesn't give us forever to repent. There is a deadline in all that God does. His patience is long, his patience is not forever. And so that's one reason I believe he wanted me to write this book, to warn people that the time is getting short. 10 years ago, I would not have said that. In fact, 10 years ago, people talked about the end time. I said, oh, it's coming, but it's going to be 100 years, 200 years, way down the road. Mm-hmm. But things have gotten so bad, so fast.
Fast is correct, sure.
That I now believe it's going to be a whole lot quicker than that. I mean, it could actually be in my lifetime, which doesn't have too many years left. But it's going to be soon.
I knew that we were going to do this podcast today, and I thought it was interesting. I read this quote this morning, and it says, believing everything came from nothing takes more faith than believing everything came from God.
God has the mind to make all the organization that we see around us. I mean, the world is incredibly organized. Even when we think about think of the wild parts of the world. Go in the forest where there's been no humans out there to tend to anything, and yet the incredible organization that goes on. The flowers know exactly where to point to get the maximum amount of sunlight or leaves and such, and the trees know which way to go to grow. They grow up, they don't go down. I mean, they have roots, of course, but they're looking to grow up as high as they can get. So there's organization. The birds, they know how to build the nest. A lot of these birds have never, they only know their parents for a very short time and then fly away, and they never see their parents build a nest. But they know how to build one. So how do they do that? How do they know how to build a nest? Because God programmed them to build nests. There's organization in everything in the world. We may think of the world as being chaotic, and to our eyes, sometimes it does appear chaotic, but even if you think of something like a storm, a hurricane. We just had a hurricane a little while ago down in Florida and did a huge amount of damage. But was that hurricane organized? Actually, it was completely organized. It had the eye, it had the center, it had the winds, it had all the rest. It was organized. In fact, that's one of the reasons they could predict where it's going to go, because it was so organized they could predict.
Isn't that an interesting way to look at it? That is true.
But it was. Now, if you can say, well, didn't God love the people of Florida? And the answer is yes, he did. But he always gives us a chance. He gave even the people of Florida, he gave them a warning. But keep this in mind. In this world, there is no such thing as physical security, period. Physical security doesn't exist. But there is spiritual security. Right. I mean, I could walk out of this building right now and get hit by a bus, or more likely a truck. There are not too many buses around. But a truck, I don't know I don't know if I'm going to get home tonight alive. I don't. I think I will, but I don't know that. And there are people out there walking around right now who are not going to get home alive. So there's no physical security in this world, period. But there can be spiritual security. And that's what Noah had. He had absolute spiritual security. And because of that, he actually ended up with physical security for a time. But even Noah eventually died. But his spiritual security made sure that he would someday be with the Lord. Just as someday I will be with the Lord in heaven, because he's promised me that. Because I believe all the words he said in his Bible, including the first words in Genesis to the last words in Revelation. And the book is about things like that. How can we know for sure God's telling us the truth? Look around you, you can see it. You can see all the evidence of the flood, you can see all the evidence of everything. Organization. To believe that it all came from nothing is absurd, it's ridiculous. And even evolutionists know that. And they know the idea of the Big Bang, the way they present it, doesn't make any sense. Because if there actually was that little speck that supposedly the Big Bang came out of, that should have been the most powerful black hole that ever existed, anywhere, and it shouldn't have exploded. It should have just kept collapsing on itself, because there should have been enormous gravity within that. I mean, the whole point of the black hole is the idea that gravity is so powerful, things get sucked in and they never come back, including light, which is what I call black holes.
So many things and discussions and topics in regard to Genesis, and without giving too much of it away, let's talk about your book a little bit.
Well, the book, again, it takes a point of view of a character protagonist called Kenan. And the reason I had Kenan as the protagonist to tell the story is because I thought if someone outside of Noah's family, outside of the compound when Noah was doing all the work, told it, they could tell a story in a way that people who were in the compound all the time really wouldn't know it as well. Kenan lived with a very evil family, which they all were, because it makes it clear they're all bad. His wasn't any worse, but it certainly wasn't any better than anyone else's. And he killed people, and he did all kinds of terrible, awful things, because that was what everybody else did.
Sure.
He lived up to the expectation of those around him, which to some degree we all tend to do. And so I tell a story about how he eventually was able to get a dragon, what we today call dinosaurs, and how he was able to get one and tame it. And then the things that happened after he had to tame his own tame dragon, his own tame dinosaur. Because when we think about dragons and dinosaurs, we somehow think dragons are mythical, but dinosaurs, were real. Mm-hmm. But they're both the same thing, they're just different names. If I have a dog and I say my hound did this, is it the same creature? Yes.
Of course.
Dog and a hound, same thing. Because you have different names doesn't change what they are. Dragons was just the old-fashioned name for dinosaur. Dinosaur is the new-fashioned name for dragons.
So interesting. That could lead off and splinter into so many different directions.
Could. And there's artwork all over the world about people who lived with dragons, what we call dinosaurs, who lived with them and made artwork of them, sculptures, paintings, all kinds of stuff, all over the world. It wasn't just like this one little place where they could say, well, that's just someone's imagination. How could people in different cultures, separated by thousands of miles, in some cases thousands of years,
right,
come up with exactly the same ideas
right,
about dragons, dinosaurs? And we know that there were flying dragons. Today we call them pterosaurs. They're just flying dragons, that's all. And there are pictures of flying dragons, again, all over the world. And so, again, a lot of these things that people like to scoff at, oh, no, that's just nonsense, that's just make-believe, that's just a myth. They found that isn't true at all. And so we see that everywhere, all over the world. And again, one time I've been asked this on several occasions. I was doing public speaking, and that is, where is Atlantis? And we may want to get into this more in the next one.
Okay.
But we'll get into Atlantis. But the point is, where's Atlantis? And I say, it's right where you're sitting. Right now, we're in Tennessee. This was Atlantis.
It's not in the Greek islands anymore?
No, it isn't. It isn't in the Greek islands at all. Because Atlantis is actually an Egyptian story. It was taken from Egypt by a man named Solon around 500 BC. He took it back to Greek and wrote about it. One of the people who read his writings later was a man named Plato. Now, most people may not have heard of Solon, but they've heard of Plato.
Of course.
And when they read Plato's writings, he wrote about Atlantis because he read about it from Solon. And because they read it in Plato's writings, they thought it was a Greek story. So they kept looking for Atlantis
right,
all around the Greek Isles.
Wow.
But that's not the case. It wasn't Santorini, which some people thought might have been it. It wasn't this. It was all of it. It was North America, South America, Africa, Europe, because the evidence all indicates very clearly that before the flood, there was one big continent. There have been different names given to it, but it was one big continent and one big ocean. And that ocean is, today we call it the Pacific.
Right.
If you were to take North and South America, shove them up against Africa and Europe, they'd fit nicely. Not perfectly. Some people say, oh no, they don't fit perfectly. Of course they don't, because they're ripped apart. and then they were eroded, and then they were added to, and all sorts of things happened. But the basic outline is there.
So interesting. It's just an amazing world, isn't it?
It is an amazing world, and when you look at it correctly from a biblical point of view, it really makes amazing sense why things are the way they are, why God did what he did, and had us become all that we are.
First of all, thank you for your time today, and we'd like to thank our listeners out there today. Also, listeners can go to your website, I know, shadowoftheark.com, in order to purchase In the Shadow of the Ark, now for sale. Please like our podcast, In the Shadow of the Ark, and share with your friends and family. It's available where good podcasts are distributed, such as iHeart and Apple.